I always considered myself logical, perhaps too logical. I teach criminology, a field that searches revoltingly for truth, founded on evidence, analysis, and logic. If you had told me 2 weeks ago that I would be on the fringe of my career, or worse, explaining my part in a diabolical hoax, I would have laughed in your face. But that was before the note. Before that cold, cryptic piece of paper left on my desk, foretelling the death of a student I had barely met. Although it was not unusual for students to joke or do pranks, something about the note felt creepingly chilling. It was hastily handwritten, like a frightened little kid rushing to convey something he thought might be his last chance. My gut churning told me that something wasn't right. This was no joke. As I left the empty lecture hall, still holding the note in hand, a wave of paranoia settled over me. What if this was legitimate? What if for once someone among the students was really subjected to danger, and only I could bait a trap and help them? The first impulse was to go to the campus police, deemed too hasty in getting there. This could still be a prank. I opted for the closest alternative. I returned to my office and began scrolling through my students' profiles. The name that kept coming back to me was that of Todd Miller. We had spoken before, maybe twice, yet his presence left some echoes of his personality. There was something different about him. The intensity in his eyes spoke of despair. He was just too conspicuous. I recalled that he had asked me about disappearing in our last conversation. At that time, it just sounded like a harmless question out of curiosity. However, it now rang ominous and was maybe even a prelude to the note. Without another moment spent in my office, I grabbed my coat and called him on the phone while running across the campus toward the student dormitories. The phone rang and rang as I grew more worried with each ring of the unforgiving telephone. Just as I reached the door, it became apparent to me that I would need a student key card since the door was locked. I banged on the glass and willed someone to open the door. Eventually, a student opened the door. I mumbled a hasty thanks and bounced, knowing that I couldn't waste much time. I reached Todd's door, knocked, and tried to maintain a semblance of calm. When no one answered, I knocked harder, then pounded. Before long, I was about to call for some other next movement to take when the door creaked open, and Todd's roommate, Liam, stood staring at me. "Is Todd here?" I asked, likely sounding a bit frantic. Liam looked at me, confusion and concern in his eyes. "No, I think he left earlier today for a family thing or something." Liam looked startled. "Really? He's never been quite right in the head, if I'm being honest." He scarcely said a word. Just packed his bag and left. "Why? It's probably nothing," I said with a weak smile, lying. "Thanks for updating me. But it felt like something." I left the dormitory, hearing the note weigh down on me like a stone star. The cold evening air pierced my skin as I thought of what to do next. Call the cops? Try to call Todd's family? These were horrible choices to make, and with each passing moment I felt like I was somehow failing him even more. Finally, I walked back into my office, searching for some light, hoping to make connections to find out something. Several hours of picking a trail through Todd's contacts and calling his family yielded a voice on the other end, Todd's mother. It was late and I felt spent. Cold, brusque, and very businesslike, with only a hint of tremor at the mention of Todd on the other end. "No, he hasn't come home." "Why would he?" Irritation was etched into her voice. "I was worried," I carefully added. "He seemed a bit disturbed, maybe overwhelmed with school. I just wanted to make sure he is safe." She emitted a bitter laugh. "Safe? Todd has always been one to cause complications. Thank you for your concern, Dr. Reed. I will let you know if I hear from him." The phone went dead cold in my hand and my stomach tensed up a notch. The tone in her last remark was one of sad dismissal. Getting back was merely inconceivable. Would they feel exhausted of trying to find him after he had run away earlier? I was still inside my office looking at this note when my phone buzzed. A text message flashed on the screen from an unrecognized number, and I opened it up with trembling fingers. "Stop looking for me. It's too late. He dies tonight." An icy chill rushed through me. Was it a taunt? A warning? I still don't know what to think about it. I was desperate as I read the message over a few times and called back, but it went directly to voicemail. My stomach twisted tighter with every vibration until the last ring went unheard. Maybe I should call the police, I thought. And yet another message came through. "If you want to save him, go to the forest beyond Westbrook Road. Now." I knew the woods, a dense protrusion into real wilderness not far outside of town. A place someone could easily get lost in. With no real choice left, I grabbed my car keys and raced away, leaving the campus behind as I sped toward the woods. The sun had just slipped below the horizon and shadows had stretched their dark fingers over the trees. When I stepped out to the edge of the forest, dread gripped me. The wind swept through the branches, and the fading light spilled an eerie, unnatural hue over all. I could not rid myself of the notion that I had been lured here, but I couldn't allow my conscience to stop me. I entered the woods, treading on a narrow path, lighted only by the flashlight of my phone. Each sound appeared amplified: the crunching of my feet on fallen leaves, the swishing of branches, my own hurried breathing. I was scanning the way ahead of me, straining to catch the sight of some human or thing. As I moved deeper into the woods, the darkness too enveloped me more, until I could hardly see my own hand just in front of me. Just about to give up and head back, I saw something in the distance. A figure lay sprawled near a creek, motionless. My heart was thumping now, dread and fear mixing stronger with each step I took. I touched the ray of my flashlight on the figure, and there he was, Todd. He lay face down in the shallow water, his clothes all wet, color drained from his skin in the cold glow of my flashlight. I crouched beside him, reached down and put my fingers on his wrist, hardly harboring any hope. Nothing. No pulse. He felt cold, his face was no longer alive. A sickening sensation began to wash over me. I felt I had been too late, drawn here like a beating moth, to find him like this. I had no idea what to do next. I fumbled for my phone, heart racing, calling 911 while my supplying breaths came in labored gasps and shaking hands as I gave my location. But while I was speaking to the dispatcher over the phone, another nasty thought crept into my mind. What if the note had led me here? Why had someone sent me those messages? It all seemed so unconnected, and the growing suspicion gnawed at me. The cops would come, all flashlights to the dark, adding their red and blue light surreal flashes amongst the trees. I would tell them the whole truth: the note, my concerns about Todd, the tones of the messages. They would listen, of course, but I could tell they were having a hard time buying it. The detective was a very weathered, no-nonsense man who introduced himself to me as Detective Sawyer. He listened to my story in complete silence, a deep frown creasing his face as he took in every detail. When I finished, he just stared at me while he tapped his pen against his notebook. "Convenient, isn't it?" he said at last. I felt hot blood rushing into my face. "I don't know what you mean. That you respected the note, that you tracked him here." He raised an eyebrow, his tone more ominous now. "You're his professor, right? Students tend to idolize their professors. Sometimes relationships get complicated." My heart sank when I realized what he was implying. This wasn't a personal relationship. I was trying to help him. Detective Sawyer shrugged. "Maybe. But if you ask me, it all looks conducted on purpose." That night I left the woods defeated and haunted by Sawyer's words. I had no idea the twisted depths to which Todd had sunk until he talked with Liam, Todd's roommate, a few days later. Although he was wary at first, Liam eventually began to share his story, pacing back and forth as he spoke with nervous eyes. "Todd, He was not just talking about disappearing, he said in a whisper. He had it all planned. I didn't take him seriously, I thought he was joking. But he said he'd erase everything, that no one would ever find him. He wanted to break free from his family, from his life here. A strange combination of relief and horror washed over me. Todd had faked his own death, all very elaborate, and I was stirred into a pawn, a suspect. The note, the messages, the body in the woods, it was all a hoax. I returned to Detective Sawyer with my newfound information. I showed him the deleted emails that I had succeeded in recovering, the various identities Todd had been creating. He was skeptical for some time, but as I laid the evidence in front of him, I saw the glimmer of understanding in his eyes. So you're saying he faked all of this, he said slowly. To run away and leave his old life behind? I nodded. And I was used as bait, a distraction from his plan. Detective Sawyer let out a low whistle. That's one hell of a scheme. But we'll find him. He can't hide forever. Todd was never found, although the police continued their investigation for many months. It was as if he'd disappeared into thin air. The various identities and discarded plans he left behind were just testimony to that. He never came back to campus, never resurfaced under any of the names he'd concocted. Life continued moving on, but I would never forget those dark days. Todd had woven his escape with such perfection and intricacy that he had duped everyone around him, and nearly destroyed me in the process. One morning, months after my life got back to normal, a last letter, and signed, written in the same scrawled handwriting, was left on my desk. You were quite a worthy opponent, Dr. Reed. Hope you enjoyed the game as much as I did. I held the note in my hands, staring in disbelief at the very words. Todd was out there, living his new life, his elaborate game concluded. And while I knew I would never run into him again, I couldn't shake the feeling of the shadow of his plan hanging over me, as if he were still watching, always waiting, always in control.